often our neighbors become first responders. And so our virtual format this year is a little different, and while we certainly miss seeing each other face to face, we're trying to take advantage of all the virtual opportunities we can to have conversations together. So I'm very thankful for today and for each of you joining, and especially our panelists. Before we get into meeting our panelists, I want to just do some housekeeping items for us all together. We should have everybody on mute right now, and just kind of double check that to help everyone hear. We're going to be doing some Q&A, and we're really excited about the Q&A piece of this, and would like you to direct your questions using the chat feature. Our panelists will be reviewing those throughout the presentation, and will respond to them and work them in as they create space. So they'll be adjusting to accommodate questions. If you would like to direct your question to a particular person, please note that in the chat box, so that helps everybody just keep track of where we are. And finally, we're going to be recording our time today. So we're about ready to press record on our meeting. So if you'd like to, if you feel a little uncomfortable with your cameras on, you could turn those off or exit if you'd like. Getting started in the spirit of neighboring during these challenging times, our conversation this morning is called One Neighborhood Together. And we are delighted to have guests in from Pittsburgh. Many of you will remember back in October 27th in 2018, there was a shooting at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. And many of our communities, we have friends and family there, and know that this was a tragedy indeed. Our panelists have mobilized together in response to that. They pulled neighbors together, they pulled the community together to be neighbors and to respond with kindness, loving kindness. And so it's my pleasure to introduce to you three guests that we have from Pittsburgh today. Rabbi Ron Symons is the founding director of the Center for Loving Kindness and Civic Engagement at the Jewish Community Center of Greater Pittsburgh. Reverend Liddy Barlow is the executive minister of Christian Associates of Southwest Pennsylvania. And Fred Brown is the president and CEO of the Forbes Fund. Unfortunately, Bill Eisler, who's the president emeritus of the Fred Rogers Productions, is unable to join us this morning because of Joanne Rogers passed away last Thursday. So he's at a memorial service for Joanne Rogers, who's Mr. Rogers' spouse. So thank you, Rabbi Ron and Reverend Liddy and Fred. I appreciate your time, and I will now let you take it away.
Well, thank you, Chad. We're so grateful to be able to be with you. And for our part, Liddy and I are going to share for about 15 or 20 minutes some of the foundational concepts that we utilize here in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. I do want to clarify that the work that we do preceded October 27, 2018. We know that this work is foundational to community, no matter what age you're in, no matter what events there are. And we're just, we're humbled to be able to be messengers of it. Liddy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would echo the gratitude to be in this space with you. And I think hopefully together we can lay a foundation for when we talk about neighbor, what does that mean? And get into some of the rich layers of meaning in that concept, both from the historical scriptures and traditions of our faith traditions, but also from our lived experience in Pittsburgh over these last few years.
So we thought we'd begin by singing a little bit. And we know that Zoom singing is a real challenge, but if you're on mute and you want to sing along, you're welcome to do so. I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Hope you enjoyed that rendition. Actually, I am standing about 150 feet from where Fred Rogers went to church. In fact, it's this very corner. This picture is actually from the evening of October 27th, as people guided by our high school students in Squirrel Hill actually joined together because they knew they had to be together. The point of view from of the photo actually is from Sixth Presbyterian Church's lawn. And you can see across the street on the left is the library. There's Cold Stone Creamery right on the right corner. And the corner that's not viewed is actually where the JCC is. And the JCC became the center for the immediate response for the FBI, for the Salvation Army, for the Department of Justice, for the state of Israel, for the city. They all took up offices right at the JCC immediately following the shooting. And now, aside from the work that we do on a regular basis through the Center for Loving Kindness and the daily work that we do, we also are the home of the 1027 Healing Partnership, which is a federally funded resiliency center. Go figure. The federal government now understands that when 5 or more neighbors are killed by gun violence, they have a responsibility to fund for 3 years resiliency work in that neighborhood. What a sad state of affairs we're in. How much more we have to dream, right, to get to the right place. Today, we want to focus on this verse from the Hebrew Scriptures. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am Adonai. I am the Lord. Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, ani Adonai. We learn from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the great rabbi who was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, who unfortunately died just about 2 months ago or so. He reminds us that what is amazing about this verse is when you look back historically, nowhere else in the ancient world did anyone mandate that you have to love your neighbor. To mandate love. What an amazing concept way back when. What a needed concept for us today. And of course, while it is that we know that the origins of the verse, right, are in the book of Leviticus, the Hebrew Scriptures, we know that it has been shared through Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and through our work, Liddy and I can attest that there is no religion of the 9 world religions that are represented in Greater Pittsburgh that says, no, we don't like love your neighbor as yourself. All of us embrace this. It's ubiquitous.
So for Christians, we first encounter this idea of love your neighbor as yourself in the first couple pages of the Gospel of Matthew, in Jesus's great Sermon on the Mount. And throughout that sermon, there's a number of times when Jesus uses this turn of phrase, you have heard it said, but I say to you. Now, sometimes as Christians, we have incorrectly read that turn of phrase as Jesus introducing brand new material that was totally foreign to the Judaism from which he came. But actually, what Jesus is doing there is engaging in a kind of rhetoric that is very deeply Jewish. One thing that I have learned from our interfaith work is that Judaism is a 4,000-year conversation and argument between rabbis and religious scholars, that one person says something and somebody else is like, no, let me get clear on this. So Jesus is engaging in this kind of rabbinical dialogue. And out of that, he says, you've heard it said this, you've heard this one interpretation of that verse from Leviticus, and I'm going to reinforce a different interpretation of that verse from Leviticus. That when we say neighbor, we mean everybody, even our enemies. It's okay, Ron, you can rush me. That's fine.
Well, I wasn't trying to rush you. I clicked wrong.
I know it. Go on. So Jesus elaborates on this even further in a famous parable that we've come to know as the parable of the Good Samaritan. And if you look at that parable in context, it begins when a lawyer stands up and asks Jesus a trick question. A question that this lawyer already knows the answer to. He says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And, Jesus has been around the block. He knows how these things go. So he says, well, what does it say in the book? And the lawyer reels off the passage around, I have to love the Lord my God, and I have to love my neighbor. Jesus is like, yeah, so go do that. And then here's where the trickiness deepens. The lawyer says, well, then who is my neighbor? What the lawyer is trying to do here is to search for a loophole. The lawyer is trying to create two lists, a list of people I have to love and people it's okay if I don't. To respond, Jesus tells this story. He says, there was a man who was beaten along the road, and two religious people came and passed him by without stopping. But the third person who came along the road was a foreigner, a member of a religious and ethnic group with whom usually you wouldn't have any dealings at all. And it was that third person, the Samaritan, who bandaged the wounds, cared for the man, paid for his future care. It's interesting, as I was preparing for today, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I looked up King's references to this parable. And King, it turns out, actually preached from this parable in the final speech of his life and ministry, his speech in Memphis on the evening before he died. He mentioned this parable. And he talks about the Samaritan as an example of dangerous unselfishness. That the Samaritan was actually putting himself potentially in harm's way by offering this deed of assistance. King writes, the first question that the priest asked, the first question that the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But the Good Samaritan came by and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? So as he came to the end of his parable, Jesus went to his next PowerPoint slide.
That's what I thought he did.
Yeah, it's funny how that works.
Let me know when we're ready.
Yeah, keep going. Jesus asked this question. He said, which one of these three people was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? So you heard that original question from the lawyer, right? Who is my neighbor? Jesus here is asking, who was a neighbor? And the guy is, he can't even make himself say Samaritan. He's like, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus says, go and do likewise. Now, I think that the really profound and revolutionary thing that Jesus does here is he takes that question, who is my neighbor, in which neighbor is a noun, in which neighbor is one of two potential categories of people, neighbors and not neighbors. And Jesus turns that question on its end and makes neighbor a verb. Not who is my neighbor, but who was a neighbor, who neighbored in this story, and who can you neighbor, and who neighbors.
I'm on the right.
I love that teaching, Liddy, and I love how you take the parable of the Good Samaritan and help us understand that neighbor is in fact a verb, and that's what we all need to be focusing on. And so, in fact, in the 10th century, just about 1,000 years ago, one of the most basic principles that was established in the Midrash from years on past was that this is what the Holy One said to Israel: "My children, what do I seek from you? I seek nothing more than that you love one another and honor one another." Wouldn't it be amazing, right, if on this day of the MLK commemoration, on this day when we are in such turmoil as a country, that people actually were to follow that standard? And it's not just us, right? It's not just Jews and Christians, but also from the Baha'i community. We can read that ascribe not to any soul that which thou wouldn't have ascribed to thee, and say not that which thou dost not. Blessed is he who preferreth his brother before himself. We can keep on going, quote after quote, from Baha'i and Native American. We'll see that also in a little bit. But why don't we go to our ultimate childhood teacher, who helps us bring out the child within each of us and understand what is most important in our world. And Fred taught us that every human being has value. This is the basis of all healthy relationships. Through living each day as it is given to me, I've learned that it cannot be taught, but it can be caught from those who live their lives right along with us. What a privilege to be able to look for the good in our neighbor. So the question that we want to ask is, why are we connected to each other, right? How does that actually work? Liddy, I think this slide is yours.
I think so. Yeah. So for Christians, we have often used this metaphor of the body of Christ to describe our relationship, especially among other Christians. That we picture all of the Christians in the world, no matter our background or tradition, as being part of the same mystical body. And just as the parts in a body are different from one another, so there is that beautiful, rich diversity amongst believers and disciples. And yet, like a body, all of us can, at our best, when we sometimes catch those glimpses of being able to work as a united whole. Just like when you are going for a run, you need your toes and you need your lungs and you need your arms and you need your brain, right? Of all working in concert. Ideally, that is what we see when we are connected one to another.
And Judaism shares in that concept, of course, not with the concept of Christ, but in the concept that we all are connected. So the great philosopher, 20th century philosopher, Martin Buber, who of course is Jewish, but is embraced by so many different faith traditions, tells us this great story. I'll put it into modern parlance. He has a bagel and he has this really big knife. And he doesn't have one of those guillotines, right, in order to cut it, or even one of those protectors that you put in your hand. So he's cutting, he has the bagel in his left hand, he has the knife in his right hand, and he starts cutting, and accidentally his right hand that's guiding the knife slices into his left hand. He asks the question, what do? Do you immediately put down the bagel, put down the knife, and then with your left hand pick up the knife and stab your right hand out of vengeance? Well, of course, the answer is no. That we are all a part of one larger body. And even when we are insulted by one aspect, by one piece of that body, right, we have no right to then pick up and to have vengeance in that way.
Yeah, and we see that wisdom also mirrored across other world faith traditions, including in various kinds of Native American spirituality, with the sense that all is really one, as Black Elk said, that the nature of all created things is somehow linked into a single organism. And yeah, and Fred elaborated on this, suggesting that perhaps that unity extends even to the relationship between God and humanity. I wonder if God and neighbor are somehow one, if loving God and loving neighbor might ultimately be the same thing.
And so what we do here is we redefine neighbor from a geographic term to a moral concept. That means to say that it's not good enough just to say, yeah, you're my neighbor, you live on my block, you live in my community, you live in my city, and so what? But that we actually have a responsibility to be the noun in action, right? To be the verb, right? To actually do things that care about the people who are both most vulnerable around us, and also people who are just like us, right? Not vulnerable, but vulnerable in other ways, not vulnerable in the perceivable ways, but that we have a responsibility, a moral responsibility to be with each other. We learned that, in fact, from Rabbi Joachim Prince. You can see that the setting of that photo is, in fact, the March on Washington. Prince, who escaped from Germany, who relocated to Germany, to New Jersey, became colleagues with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And his speech on that day in 1963 was the very last speech before King took the podium to tell us about his dream. In that speech, he tells us that neighbor is not a geographic term, it is a moral concept. They put Prince in front of King for two reasons, I believe. One, in celebration of their personal relationship. And two, to remind us that if we don't live up to this as it relates to civil rights in America, then we will be threatened by the atrocities that happened in Germany. And boy, that simple message That simply seems to be so true in our world today. We need to listen, we need to act. So for the Center for Loving Kindness at the JCC, we strengthen the fabric of community by amplifying those long-held values of love your neighbor as yourself and do not stand idle while your neighbor bleeds, while we redefine neighbor from a geographic term to a moral concept. We've been doing that on this platform for 4 years now, but it's a concept that we, the JCC, have been living for 125 years of our existence. And we know that so many organizations, so many good organizations, right, are doing the same work across our city, across our state, across our country.
Yeah, and so like, what's a coalition of churches doing in this business? We, as Christian Associates of Southwest Pennsylvania, we bring together Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Christians. We've been doing this for 50 years. And throughout that 50-year period, we have also been engaged in the work of interfaith relationship building, representing the church in civic, community, and interfaith spaces. Because we know that if we are going to be the church in all the ways that we might be a blessing to our neighbors, that means that we have to model that kind of positive relationship with our neighbors of many faiths and our neighbors of no faiths as well.
And so just to get a little theological, right, we want to talk about the world to come, right? Olam haba in Hebrew actually is always translated as the world to come. It's what's going to happen when the Messiah comes. Please do keep in mind that Jews believe in the Messiah. We simply don't think the Messiah has come yet, but that doesn't keep us from working with Christian brothers and sisters towards that ultimate dream. I prefer actually not to translate Olam Haba as the world to come, as most people do. I prefer to translate it as the world yet to be. And that world yet to be actually begins right now, based on our actions, based on how we neighbor, based on how we are neighbored, based on how it is that we raise our children. We have that responsibility.
Yeah, and in Christianity, Jesus has blessed us with this concept of the kingdom of God, which is to be our first priority as we go about the world. And the kingdom of God is a complicated metaphor in the Gospels. Sometimes Jesus speaks about it as if it is awaiting us on the other side of history. Sometimes Jesus makes it sound as if it's something that's right here now. And as Christians have wrestled with those various ideas over time, we've kind of settled on this sense that the kingdom is here and the kingdom is to come. And as we are living in this space where the kingdom has arrived but is not yet completely realized, each one of us can do our part to make the ways the kingdom is already among us a little bit more visible right here in our own neighborhoods through our own acts of love and service and compassion.
And of course, the person that helps us do that best, not just here in Squirrel Hill, but in every neighborhood. Fred says, let's take the gauntlet and make goodness attractive in the so-called next millennium. That's the real job that we have. I'm not talking about a Pollyannish kind of stuff. I'm talking about down to earth, actual goodness. People caring for each other in a myriad of ways rather than people knocking each other off all the time. What changes the world? The only thing that ever really changes the world is when somebody gets the idea that love can abound and can be shared. So we're hopeful that all of that serves as a foundation, as a motivation, upon which and towards which we can actually do something different for our neighbors.
Yeah, and I think that works best when we take these lofty ideals and put them into practical work. Whether that's picking up folks by the side of the road, whether that's showing up with our umbrellas on street corners when we are most needed. This is the work that we are called to across all of our faith traditions. And we're really grateful to have folks like Fred in our community, not Fred Rogers, but Fred Brown, I'm actually talking about now, to help us see some of those practical ways that we can put neighboring into action.
Thank you, Liddy. Neighboring is so critical given the state of our world. This pandemic has really created a response mechanism for us that is pushing our neighboring capacity to another level. And so how we move aggressively in this moment is critical. I am harking back to the work that Ron and I did several years ago that really started this notion of creating a belonging community. I would say the framework for this conversation really began with looking at that time, a 30-year inflection point analysis, and now a 29-year one. For example, we have some pressing issues. How will we deal with rental and mortgage moratoriums being lifted? How are we currently dealing with the political division and armed civil unrest in 2021 as a carryover from 2020? In 2022, how are we looking at the long-term impacts of COVID and the COVID recovery plan? 2023, what is the role of racial equity as an ecosystem? 2024, how are we dealing with income inequality? 2025, what is the projected role of AI and machine learning? 2026, how are we addressing the potential collapse of Medicare? 2030, climate change. 2040, how are we addressing the minority population shifting the US to the majority? In 2050, how are we addressing 70% of the world's population moving towards the urban corridor? In Pittsburgh and Southwestern PA, our city has done a pretty significant analysis of the work around our equity indicators. And housing remains a very critical component to our work. When we look at communities like Homewood that experience 41% poverty, 27% homelessness, 43% mobility, meaning the kid moves at least once in the school year, we begin to understand the ecosystem that's required to really help us reimagine our work. With Libby and Ron, we have the unique opportunity to marry multiple worldviews into a common framework to reimagine our work. In my opinion, it needs to move from systems change, where we're optimizing the collective capacity of a system, to ecosystems co-creation, where we're optimizing the capacity of human beings to work more earnestly and collectively together towards a common objective or North Star. There are three types of homelessness that we're worried about. Primary homelessness, people without conventional housing. Secondary homelessness, which is move frequently. This is sometimes referred to as couch surfing, and people living in boarding houses. And tertiary homelessness, living primarily in boarding houses and canvassing parks and such. And this notion that we have over 4,100 homeless children in our Allegheny County it's unimaginable. And so when you think about the role of education, it's important to kind of understand the entire framework for our work is not based just solely on one framework, but the intersection of multiple frameworks. And so I want to share with you a notion of how we look at our work at the Forbes Funds.
Our region is evolving from an industrial past to an AI and robotics present and future. This arc has shifted the skill sets of the population, requiring the nonprofit sector to become more agile and iterative. The Forbes Fund's mission is to build the capacity of human services and community development nonprofits in Western Pennsylvania through a systems-based approach. Each of our core program pillars increases the nonprofit capacity of our region. At the Forbes Funds, we co-design locally. New community development is pushing resilient people to first and second ring suburbs. Our work at the Forbes Fund seeks to build capacity throughout the sector by going deeper in each community through co-designed capacity building approaches that focus on the unique assets of each community. We act regionally. Western Pennsylvania is evolving, and these swift changes have highlighted the difference between thriving and surviving communities. Today, more than ever, the Forbes Funds is needed to bridge the region's growing divide. We are continuously adapting our core programs to meet the diverse and dynamic needs of the sector. Finally, we think globally. The Forbes Funds uses a dual framework, two systems each reinforcing the other, for quantifying our impact in a rigorous and meaningful way. These rubrics, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the Social Determinants of Health, have been adopted respectively by the City of Pittsburgh and other regional partners, as well as governments around the world, as a blueprint for a healthy population. Join us and let us join you. Capacity building begins at forbesfunds.org.
This notion of capacity building is built solely on relationships. Over the last 36 months at the Forbes Funds, we've pivoted to look at the distribution of our resources through a framework that looks at the social determinants of health. I think this is what happens when you don't get any sleep and work 7 days a week. Through this work, and I keep referring to Rabbi Ron and Liddy because after the Tree of Life happened in the city of Pittsburgh, we really began to think through the nonprofit sector, how can we be more tangible on the ground? How can we look at our work more earnestly from a transformational framework and not transactional one? And so we at the Forbes Funds really began to shift our focus and to look at how we can distribute resources through a framework that we can analyze our resource allocation and look at strategic collaborations and partnerships. This new imagining of our work constituted a pivot towards the adoption of the social determinants of health, which really gave us a clear line of sight to how we work strategically and collaboratively more in the sector. When we started looking at neighborhood and the built environment, we understood that housing was a critical component. And we began to look at not just housing and addressing the 21,000 affordable houses needed in our area, but moreover, the conditions of existing houses, the environmental factors, and also the exposure to toxins as another secondary impact when we start to explore the need for housing. We also know that housing has a direct correlation with employment, food security, and leading to poverty. We also know that education is a critical component in this ecosystem. And so when we talk about housing, housing in and of itself is just not one of the core issues. It's part of an entire ecosystem that demonstrates its impact in multiple ways. One of them is being without housing. The other notion is community context, which Fred Rogers was highly motivated about, really creating frameworks where our social cohesion allowed us to see our neighbors as ourselves and really transform race, ethnicity, and social economic strata. And so today we know that the health and healthcare sector is also a critical component as many people remain in their homes afraid of COVID and not dealing with their needs directly. 46 weeks ago, we partnered with Nora Bateson in Sweden to launch the Warm Data Labs framework called People Need People. The goal was to look at the physical distancing and social isolation that was taking place as a result of COVID and cultivate a new virtual community. That work at the Forbes Funds constituted 42 community sessions that were 2 hours in length that really began to dig deeply into looking at the holistic nature of the community at the grassroots level, not just the need for housing, but the entire ecosystem as part of a structural framework for our response mechanism. So our plan was pretty simple. As a result of George Ford and Breonna Taylor and the Tree of Life, we really began to look at racial equity through the Forbes Funds as a more on-the-ground framework. We also looked at this notion of co-created cohorts that looks at the design mechanisms at the formal, mediated, and informal service delivery unit. And we use this framework to really create work at the micro level, on the ground, meso level with nonprofit organizations, macro level with governmental agencies, and global level with those issues that attract and reflect the 29-year inflection point report. And then also we created a 2-tier application, which you saw in the video, that we moved from local to global analysis with our work in reference to our annual audits. And so a lot of this work for us was pivotal as we looked at the theory of change out of Harvard that puts forward, if you increase adult capacities, you improve kid outcomes. And so when you look at this work through a 2-gen framework, we know that we can address homelessness through a coordinated effort that looks at value in people and looks at resource distribution through a more collaborative effort. And so we've done a critical analysis with one framework where we recognize that for every dollar invested in this particular apparatus, you can achieve a $16.60 ROI, rate of return on investment. This requires strategic alignment. And so the Forbes Funds in 2018 restructured our grant making to align with this framework. And within a 4-quarter period, we increased our grant making by 400%. Now, this framework and adjusting our lens was a recent pivot that really looked at us creating this whole person framework where we optimize human beings through a human-centered design approach. We partnered with Headstorm to really create this new application. This work also looked at co-created cohorts where people who are homeless and having experiences can work together. So we started partnering with homeless organizations, and we started to look at other healthcare factors and began to explore how do we look at creating a local to global framework so that we're all using the same language and kind of looking at the same problems through a much more holistic perspective and framework. So this notion of regenerative organizational cultures is really what Fred Rogers was referring to, is when we meet people's basic needs as a focus of our core work, we allow the human beings to optimize their gifts, skills, and talents to the world. And I think what Fred distilled in us is this notion that if you take time with every person and you make time to listen intensely and you create opportunities to work and learn with one another, the life skills that become meaningful as a result of those experiences allows people to reimagine the dream. And just through their daily activity, it provides ongoing support that enhances our mental health and well-being. And so when we start looking at integrated anti-racism cohort, we believe that the Tree of Life incident highlighted for us in the city of Pittsburgh a need for deeper understanding around differences. Not that we didn't understand that in a general sense, but what I feel we failed to do is understand that in a human sense. How do we work together? We have a distinct understanding with all of our universities of an analytical framework of our city and our region. What we lack, in my opinion, is a applied science to understanding how people live, work, and play through different frameworks, ecosystems, and constructs. And so our work has really been around creating these labs that allow us to work on the ground to gain this knowledge and use that knowledge to pivot so that our grant making and strategic collaboration support the sector in an earnest way. Grant Oliphant, the head of the Heinz Endowment, made a lot of statements, but one that really was critical to me was this notion of what does a just Pittsburgh look like, and one that creates equitable opportunity for all people to thrive and achieve their fullest capacity. I refer to this as one fulfilling their dharma. This work is critical when you look at the innovation that's taking place in a new homeless shelter being built in the city of Pittsburgh. This $21 million project will serve as a forward-thinking approach to looking at how we deal with our homeless population, not from a reactive framework, but more from a proactive one. Also working with organizations like the Tree of Life, we really look at this notion of shifting to a harm reduction model, optimizing telehealth models, and collaborating with federal qualified health centers to really provide a holistic framework to serve our community in a more earnest way. So I want to thank you and kind of give you a framework of how we function and open up the presentation of questions to talk about how specifically we do that work across communities. And for clarity's sake, the city of Pittsburgh is 23 square miles. There's 90 communities. In those 90 communities, there's 43 communities with people of color. Those 43 communities have approximately 80,600 resilient people in them. Of the 80,600 resilient people, 46,000 of those people are on probation and parole. And so when I came downtown to the Forbes funds, I realized early that there's no amount of programming that can fix that. We have to really create a systems change approach. And so working with Rabbi Ron and Liddy really created a framework for us to look at what we call cross-sectoral applications to our work and how we can share that work across the state. I would close by saying, lastly, over the past 46 weeks, our work around COVID response for people
I'm on Blog TV with my fucking
people of color.
self. You fucking stupid bitch. This stupid fucking justice, oh fuck nigger.
This shift in our framework has really allowed us to explore how we serve people in a better and more humane way. Health is a critical component to our work, and health for all people resides in our ability to listen, learn, and love one another. So I want to thank Rabbi Ron and Liddy and others for inviting us to this opportunity to live, learn, and grow, and to also explore how we can deepen our capacity to love and cherish one another in a more humane and earnest way. So I want to open it up for questions, if that's appropriate, Ron and Liddy.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think we're good. I just want to let everyone know that I removed that person who interrupted us and reported them to Zoom.
quick
Unfortunately.
fingers on the block. Thank you. Sometimes neighboring is all about hitting the block button. Yeah, we have some really excellent questions that have surfaced in the chat. So I want to look at this question. For communities who want to become better neighbors at a systems level, does this best happen first through the nonprofit or the government sector? I have an answer to that, but I'll turn it to my colleagues first.
No, you start,
Yeah.
Rev.
I think the answer is yes. I think that the only way to address our problems is to do robust cross-sector work, which is something that Pittsburgh has historically that's been a strength for our community. Although I think we still have ways to grow in that. So I think that's where you really need the cooperation between nonprofits, government, industry, and faith communities. And I think that when you get all of those sectors kind of working in synchronicity is where you can really actually start to see some structural change. What do you guys think?
So I would add to that just our lived experience of doing Census 2020.
Mm-hmm.
We spent about 3 years working with over 200 organizations across every sector in Pittsburgh in order to make sure that we were all on the same page, in order to count every single person. And the success of it on the surface level was that our self-reporting rate was up 1% from 2010. Our success, though, our true success, was that we had 200 organizations working together for the same goal about making sure that everyone counts. And we got to a point where we celebrated, and some of us began to think, this is great. We'll take the playbook, we'll put it on the shelf, and 7 years from now, when we're in 2027 and we're thinking about the 2030 census, we'll come back together and we'll start working again. And many of us began to say, why are we waiting? So we're now building out a cross sector in all of Pittsburgh, something called the Belonging Network. And the idea is not just for those communities that are most vulnerable, but for all of us, because we are vulnerable in our isolation, that we need to be talking to each other, sharing shared definitions, defining shared definitions, and coming to a point where we can leverage our relationships and our learning to actually advocate for all the good that Fred put on the table for us.
I would definitely say that it's a multi-systems response. Our work has really been to create a response where we create more synergy and collaboration. If you look at history, activities have often started on the ground or at a policy level. And there's really, if you think about micro, meso, macro, and global systems, these systems all function at their own velocity and trajectory. And our goal, what we attempted to do is really create a vertical integration where we create more continuity with what's going on the ground being connected to legislation and what's being connected to nonprofits to really create a seminal messaging that aligns all sectors concurrently. We believe that that kind of alignment will speed up responses and include people's ability to have real change occur in their sector. And so we're excited about that, and we feel like our work has been able to demonstrate that through our outputs over the last 36 months at the Forbes Funds and in collaboration with others. And I say that because when I got to the Forbes Funds, we created a 200-member cross-sectorial advisory council comprised of 15 subcommittees that work every day at the micro, meso, macro, and global level. And so we're constantly getting data points that really allow us to push agenda items. As a result of that work, we meet every month with Dr. Levine regarding COVID and comorbidity issues as a way to really formalize a response that's coherent for the entire region, reflective of a group of people that are having a particular disproportionate impact as a result of this tremendous virus.
So let's get into some practicalities. There's two similar questions in the chat about what kinds of practical ways we can be neighbors to each other in the midst of COVID, which has made it much more challenging for us to be face to face and hand to hand with neighbors in the ways that we might have been able to do a year ago. So what are some opportunities for service and neighborliness that are possible in our current era of safety measures and social distancing? Ron, how are all of your volunteers at the JCC who work with your food distribution and other service programs? How have they adapted in this era?
So we've adapted in two strong ways. Aside from the direct service that we do for early childhood kids and all day at the J for elementary school kids that need a place to do their work when school's not out and their kids are away. The first is that we have this great program that was in place long before COVID called Checkmates, where members of the community, both from the senior community and the younger community, would make phone calls to seniors who were at least somewhat homebound. And we've made somewhere in the area of 8,000 phone calls since COVID began, simply saying to someone, we care about you. We want you to be with us. The second is that on a regular basis, we are, I think, the second largest senior center in Allegheny County. So we used to have lunch for 150 people every day for no more than $1.50, right? And obviously that had to shut down immediately. We've now distributed grab and go meals to over 55,000 portions, right, in the course of all this time. All of this work happens because of dedicated staff, because of dedicated volunteers. And I think that it's actually teaching us something about what does it mean to neighbor at a time when we're in struggle. But then once we get beyond this, that I think the hybrid is going to be there. And we've got to figure out what does that mean educationally? What does that mean from a community perspective? What does that mean for essential services?
Well, for us, thank you. We really do a combination of things. We still do site visits. I did 2 yesterday. I did 2 on Friday. We have hosted since COVID hit 1,287 Zoom meetings. We offered and purchased 50 Zoom sites for smaller organizations that might have had a difficult time making that pivot. Since then, we've had 15,170 participants on our calls. Our goal is really to redistribute through a regenerative framework how we educate, inform, and empower each other to understand the challenges and threats to the sector. And so we host meetings on a weekly basis. On Monday, it's an open community call for solutions. Last Monday, we had Dr. Barry Curzon on, the Dalai Lama's personal physician, to talk about well-being and the mental impacts that people are having as a result of COVID. We've had the superintendent on, foundation leaders, because we feel like it's important, given the stress and shocks to the sector, that the people in the community level hear directly from leaders. And those leaders are able to translate what is actually happening. And then that gives us the space to support the capacity needed to respond to those opportunities.
Yeah, it's interesting that the mention of Zoom meetings reminds me of a project that Rabbi Ron and I have been working on since March. In the before times, we did a lot of face-to-face relationship building and interfaith dialogue work. And in March, we made the transition to do that work online and developed a program called SOFA Spirituality, where we have short videos with interfaith spiritual leaders from across the nation, and then facilitate intimate dialogue groups of 6 or 8 or 10 people to explore the relationship of the spiritual themes in that video interview to their own lives. And what we found is there really are opportunities to make human-to-human connections in digital space. for people to have meaningful experiences and do some rich personal sharing and listening to each other, even in a Zoom format. I think, we have faced as a nation and even as a world a real epidemic of loneliness. And so I think those folks that Ron was mentioning that are receiving those phone calls, are experiencing that loneliness. So are parents of young kids whose kids are stuck home with them. So are single people, right? There's so many categories of people who are facing that real mental, spiritual, physical health challenge of loneliness, and which has been exacerbated by COVID. And the great thing about that epidemic is you don't have to be a scientist to help provide the medicine that is needed for an epidemic of loneliness. Every one of us, through picking up our phone and making that call or sending that text or walking down the street and waving at our neighbors and shouting from a safe distance, hey, hi, I live down there, I like your flowers, or whatever, we can all be the vaccine that helps tackle the epidemic of loneliness in our neighborhoods.
We're also committed to the concept of being an upstander. The upstander is the opposite of being a bystander. You could read that out from the Good Samaritan text. You could read that out from a whole bunch of different texts. But we have brought people in real life, when it was safe, into outdoor spaces in order to be those upstanders. We replanted the vegetable garden at East End Cooperative Ministries, right, in early summer, and as a result fed hundreds of people, right, with that. We've worked with neighboring communities where they knew that they just didn't have the resources to do the regular gardening, the regular cleanup at this time, and so we went together and we worked together outside to make all that happen. And you just got to find those moments where you can stand up and make a difference.
I think one of the other important questions that's in the chat is about having the courage to deal with your own fears or trepidation around reaching out to different populations. And there's no real easy way other than change moves at the speed of trust. You have to create spaces where people find commonalities to really begin to build trusting relationships that allow us to break through the strongholds in our minds that we've conjured up about being different. I love working with Rabbi Ron because we're at different ends of the spectrum in a sense. And from day one, when we first sat down at the table to do this work about 3 years ago, he was pushing for change. And that was the thing that really made me want to work with him. It wasn't the ideology as much as it was the pushing for change. And then it allowed me to have a deeper respect for the ideology. And so I think when you find the humanity in people, if you can search for the common ground at that level, then the other things people believe, do, and practice become more palatable, more capable for you to work with or collaborate with or navigate. But it's finding the human connection in people that removes the fear, that breeds trust.
And I'll reciprocate the love of Fred by saying that as we were sitting talking through the complete count committee and all of that, he laid down this one phrase which has changed my life. The phrase was complete beloved community, right? So yeah, beloved community, we know it on this day in particular, that's what King was fighting for, that's what we all have to fight for. But especially here in Pittsburgh, where we have two different Pittsburghs, one that works well for people that look like me, and one that doesn't work well for people that look like Fred. We have a responsibility, right, to make sure that the beloved community is complete. And that's the work that we have to do.
Yeah. And I think just one final word on this topic of, personal courage is to go back to that metaphor of the body, right? And I think there are so many ways that people can be of service to their neighbors that we don't all have to do the same thing, right? Like I would be a terrible scuba dive rescue worker. And that's okay because there are lots of other ways that I can help my neighbors. And so I think partly it's identifying, where are the opportunities that really use each person's individual skills and knowledge and capacities and to plug in there. And then from there, maybe there will be opportunities for risk and growth going forward.
Well, I'm going to interject here and just say our time is coming to an end. And I am very, very thankful for our panelists. If you wouldn't mind, there's a little reaction button down at the bottom. You can clap, you can snap, you can wave, you can do all kinds of things, but let's express our thanks to them however we can. And I just would encourage you throughout the rest of the day, there are a number of conversations happening, really important ones, very practical ones, from healthcare to utility services, to children's education programs, to worship services of all faiths. So please take a moment to get involved virtually and also practically. Go visit your neighbor. Really, just get to know their name. And maybe make brownies. It's not that all old-fashioned. Hospitality is an incredibly powerful way to meet people and find out that they're not always scary. They could become your first responder when you're in need. So thank you all. And I hope to see you again very, very soon. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Have a blessed day.